On July 16, 1969, at 13:32 hours UTC, the Apollo 11 space mission took off from Cape Candy. In just 12 minutes, the spacecraft cleared the atmosphere and entered into orbit at an altitude of 185 kilometers. From there, it did 1.5 laps around the Earth and then began its trip to the Moon. 4 days later, the Columbia Command Module was in lunar orbit while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed the Eagle on an area of the Moon called the Sea of Tranquility. Back on Earth, an estimated 650 million people were glued to their TVs and radios as they watched Armstrong take
one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
One of these people was a German archaeologist named Wolfgang Erich Windt, who heard Armstrong's words through his radio by the mouth of a cave in the southern mountains of Namibia, near the border to South Africa. On July 24th, when the astronauts returned safely, Windt commemorated the event by naming the cave Apollo 11. I'm sure all the locals were just like, oh, okay, I mean, we call that place Eyssl, but that's cool, it's fine, we weren't attached to that or anything. Now, like its namesake, the Apollo 11 cave was a genuinely historic discovery, although in a very different way. Inside, Windt and his team found a series of stone slabs with ancient paintings on them that were later carbon dated as 30,000 years old, making them some of the earliest evidence of humans using symbolic thinking. The drawings all depicted various animals, a zebra, a rhinoceros, and then this one, which archaeologists just call animal facing left. Some common interpretations are that these pictures tell a story, or else maybe were used for identification or to celebrate a hunt. They might also be part of a spiritual ritual. Archaeologists point to how weird the unidentified left-facing animal's hind legs look as evidence that it's meant to be half human, half animal. Personally, I think that they just look like legs that were drawn by someone with roughly the same artistic skill as I have. And honestly, that's the thing that I always find kind of weird about interpretations of cave paintings. Like, I pretty much draw like that, and the thought of someone going through my notebook and assuming that the lack of perspective is evidence of a religious ritual just feels creepy somehow. It's not an animal-human hybrid, it's just that horses are really hard to draw. It's kind of ironic that while the Apollo mission in Namibia was uncovering artifacts, its namesake on the Moon was creating some instead. Tranquility Base, the location of the Apollo landing, has been designated as a heritage site to be preserved. Not that that's particularly difficult for the foreseeable future. During their moonwalk, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin left the following things behind: a variety of geological tools and devices, a plaque signed by the Apollo astronauts and Richard Nixon, a patch from Apollo 1 to commemorate the astronauts who died in a launch pad fire, medals commemorating the first Soviet cosmonauts, a silicon disc containing goodwill messages from 73 world leaders, some boot prints, and an American flag that fell over when they were taking off. What will these mean 30,000 years from now? A story? Animal identification? A religious ritual? Spacecrafts have kind of a weird relationship to time. One aspect of this is what Karl Marx called the annihilation of space by time, referring to the tendency for technology to speed up time through things like how the engine or telegraphs allowed trips in communication that would have taken months to be done in days or seconds. Satellite technology has been one of the most dramatic drivers of this, and yet, ironically, by going into outer space, the satellites themselves enter into deep cosmic time, where events take place over billions of years. Once in orbit, time works in all sorts of strange and unintuitive ways. Someone smarter than me would probably go into how this relates to relativity, but honestly, as like a big dummy, my first thought was just to ask how long these things take to come down, and even that gets pretty weird. Also, just to get this out of the way right now, this video won't really be going into any scientific stuff. I have talked to some nerd losers who know all about that to make sure that I don't get anything wrong, but beyond that, we're going strictly off of vibes. Oh, and before I get any comments about it, I know that the plural of spacecraft is spacecraft, but I'm just gonna say spacecraft so that I sound like a normal person. The best resource I found that could give me straight up answers about when satellites come down without requiring me to learn orbital math is the RAE table of Earth's satellites, a massive book made up almost entirely of these tables listing every man-made object in orbit beginning in 1957 up until when they stopped publishing new editions in '86. Obviously, this is wildly out of date for getting an idea of what the current outer space landscape looks like, but just flipping through it and looking at how the descent dates relate to the height of the objects, you start to see how strange things get up there. Let's just go over some of the stuff we find on a random page. There's a bunch of entries all named Cosmos followed by a random number, which basically just tells you that they're Soviet. Almost all Russian satellites are just named Cosmos and then given a number ranging from Cosmos 1 in 1962 to, most recently, Cosmos 2578, launched September 17th, 2024. They do this because all Russians are massive fans of Carl Sagan. Anyways, let's just start from the bottom of the page and work our way up. Cosmos 1726 was launched on January 17, 1986, to an altitude of 663 kilometers at the furthest point of its orbit, and damn, it's not coming down until 2046. Right below that, we see 1426's rocket, which is just 2 kilometers below it, and is expected to come down at more or less the same time. Now, jumping around a bit here, let's check out Cosmos 1724. It got to a height of 333 kilometers, make a wish, and came down a reasonable 59 days later. Its rocket, on the other hand, was 15 clicks below it and came back in just 6 days. Interesting, right? Okay, maybe not, but get this. In the middle, we have Cosmos 1725, which reached an altitude of 1,003 kilometers, and it's not coming back for 1,200 years. It gets even weirder when you look at its rocket, which is only 10 kilometers below it, less than a 2-hour spacewalk away. It's coming down in 600 years? To make a bit more sense of how this works, let me give you a brief rundown of the different levels of Earth's orbit. First up is low Earth orbit, or the LEO, the size of which seems to vary a bit depending on who you're asking, but basically encompasses everything between 150 kilometers and 2,000 kilometers above sea level, with most objects in it sitting at around 800 kilometers. And this is by far the most populated orbit. Part of that's because it's the easiest to get to and communications are easier and have less latency, but also, since satellites that close can't see as much of the Earth, any communication satellites need to work in massive groups called constellations in order to get decent coverage. The LEO is where you'll find any manned missions and some scientific satellites like the International Space Station and the Hubble Space Telescope. There's also an unknown, but definitely very high number of spy satellites, and then just tens of thousands of satellite internet providers, a number that's been exploding recently as private companies have started building their own constellations, particularly Amazon's Project Kuiper and SpaceX's Starlink. Next up is medium Earth orbit, which goes from 2,000 kilometers to around 35,000. This one gets used for scientific research and space navigation, but the main thing it does for us normies is that the MEO is where most satellite positioning systems are located, like GPS, Galileo if you're in an EU country, and GLONASS if you're Russian. Finally, there's high Earth orbit, which is where things get a bit weirder. The HEO is everything above 35,000 kilometers, which doesn't have a whole lot in it. We can take it as a given that there are science satellites up there studying some nerd shit like how dust moves, but again, we don't care about that right now. Getting satellites up this high is way harder, which translates to more expensive. Plus, at this distance, signals take a lot longer to get to Earth and can have a delay of up to 5 seconds depending on the orbit, which rules out most applications. But then there's one part of high Earth orbit that's different. 35,786 kilometers above the equator is where satellites can enter geostationary orbit, also known as the GEO. In this orbit, satellites are synced up with the rotation of the Earth so that they appear motionless from the ground. This is insanely useful, since it allows the satellite to connect to just one receiver that never has to move or recalibrate. Also, from that height, the satellites can see around 42% of the Earth's surface, meaning that the entire world can be covered using just 3 satellites placed equal distances apart. These factors combine to make the GEO some of the most valuable real estate in outer space. But what I find most interesting is that unlike the satellites in the MEO or LEO, these ones will never come down. Instead, after their lifespan of around 15 years is up, they perform one final maneuver, propelling themselves a few hundred kilometers further out into graveyard orbit. Although, I think that name is somewhat misleading. Part of the point of graveyards down here is that while a grave serves as a memorial, the actual bodies decompose and eventually break down. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The furthest part of Earth's orbit is different from any other graveyard, though, because while the spacecrafts resting there suffer damage from collisions, we can expect them to remain there largely unchanged for around 5 billion years, or until the sun becomes a red dwarf. And that's the thing that's so spooky about these telecom satellites. There's a good chance that they'll be the last evidence that humans ever existed. And when you start looking into the history of satellites, especially the ones in the GEO, they don't paint a very flattering picture. And in this video, I'm gonna show you why. But first, let me quickly tell you about this video's sponsor, Ground News. In this video, we're going to dig into the world of satellites as well as the issues that can come from private companies having control of key telecommunication infrastructure as well as space itself. And one name that tends to come up when you talk about this stuff is, of course, Elon Musk. Now, Elon is a polarizing figure, kind of a maverick who doesn't play by your rules, if I may be so bold. Some people would call him a midwit freak with a breeding fetish and utter contempt for democracy. Others think that he's an aloof genius, sort of like a badass anime character who's not really good or bad, but just doing his own thing, sort of a Dark War Greymon type figure. They also think that jump he does is really cool. If you're in the latter group, then you might not know the latest details about his ongoing legal troubles in Brazil. After having been found to be spreading hate speech and misinformation to sway the Brazilian election, the country is ordering all telecom providers to ban X. However, Musk's own ISP, Starlink, is now refusing to comply, claiming that they won't do it until Brazil unfreezes their accounts. Things like this are where Ground News comes in handy. In these polarizing times, Ground News is fighting back against the bullshit and hoo-ha by providing an independent and ad-free platform that gathers related articles from more than 50,000 sources from all across the world and political spectrum in one place so that you can compare how different sources cover the same story. Plus, their blind spot feature allows you to see stories that you might not have otherwise come across because the sources reporting on them are outside of your digital echo chamber. In the case of Starlink v. Brazil, we can see how left-wing sources seem to be a lot more focused on the legal specifics as well as how many people rely on Starlink, particularly in remote parts of the Amazon rainforest, whereas right-wing outlets are focused more on how Elon's fighting for free speech and corporate freedom. Personally, I do think that we should probably be somewhat critical of Brazil's government outright banning a platform as ubiquitous as Twitter. Now, how are Brazilians supposed to reply to every post by any musician asking when they're coming to Brazil? However, it also seems very bad that by owning both a massive social media site and the satellites that provide access to it, Elon is now potentially above the law. Like, I just don't really think that should be a thing, you know? Anyways, go to ground.news/weireinhell, use the link in the description, or just scan this QR code to get 50% off of their Vantage plan. This is their best deal of the year, and it will only be available for a limited time. And if you're already a subscriber, you can send Ground News as a gift for 50% off too. The holidays are coming up after all, and we all know that the best gift is knowledge of the unspeakable horrors that are unfolding daily. Now, as weird as a bunch of telecom satellites being a representation for all of humanity may sound, they are kind of fitting. The satellites in the GEO are kind of an oddly fitting artifact of humanity, since they're a massive part of the global economy, a key part of cultural production, and have been at the center of a lot of very interesting debates about international law. And in order to tell you that story, I'm going to zoom in on that last one first. All of this begins with Sputnik. Launched into low Earth orbit by the Soviet Union, on October 4th, 1957, Sputnik became Earth's first artificial moon. The mission's success was a complete surprise to the US, who thought that they had an insurmountable lead in the space race. But one of the strangest things about this, though, was that during the 3 weeks it was operational for, no one considered this as the Soviets trespassing into enemy airspace. Before Sputnik, the borders of a country's territory continued up indefinitely, but the people of the world, including America, all seemed to agree that space was different. The UN agreed and made it official by passing a resolution stating that A, anything in space needed to follow international laws, and B, space wasn't a part of any country's territory and couldn't belong to anyone. And you know the UN doesn't mess around when it comes to violating international laws. Now, some of you may have noticed that those two rules contradicted each other, since borders are a part of international law. However, don't worry about it. It's fine. It's fine. It's good. It's good. It's not going to be an issue. It's fine. It's good. Some of you might have also noticed that it's a bit weird that the US was okay with this. What you failed to consider, though, was that they couldn't wait to just put so many spy satellites up there. And they managed to follow through on that, with the next big milestone in the space race coming in 1964, when the first satellite entered the GEO. Synchron 3 from the good old US of A. The satellite proved the usefulness of the GEO, which until then had mostly just been a theory. That same year, Synchron 3 was used to broadcast the 1964 Tokyo Olympics across continents, a breakthrough that demonstrated the tremendous value of the GEO and caused a boom in globalization and TV manufacturing. That's completely real. Lyndon B. Johnson gave a speech when Synchron 3 went into orbit, saying that the technology would help bring, quote, lasting peace among the peoples of the world. He was definitely right about it bringing something to the peoples of the world, as in a few short years this technology would be used to televise atrocities in Vietnam. The following year, Synchron 3 was joined by the Comsat Corporation's Earlybird, the first ever commercial satellite. The GEO was open for business, baby! This would soon become extremely common when, in '72, the US started their Open Skies policy, which allowed anyone to apply for orbital slots through the FCC. But there was an issue brewing here. Back in '61, the UN's resolution for the peaceful use of space had made it clear that space, and therefore the GEO, was for everyone. But now that people were actually starting to use it, it was becoming clear that there was a limited amount of room and a limited number of radio frequencies that could be used to broadcast from up there. And so, by '63, the UN's International Telecommunications Union, or ITU, was put in charge of allocating spots and frequencies. The system they wound up using was basically just first come, first served, and the first to come were a bunch of rich countries and corporations who were snatching up as many spots as they could, making the distribution of resources in space decidedly similar to that on Earth. But as the GEO was being colonized throughout the '60s, at that same time, a bunch of countries were being decolonized. And these newly freed states, particularly those on or near the equator, had some thoughts about how things had been going. In 1967, Malta motioned for the UN to establish certain areas like the high seas and Antarctica as the common heritage of mankind, meaning that they couldn't be owned by any country and instead should be jointly managed by all states for exclusively peaceful purposes. That same year, Argentina argued that this should be applied to space as well, leading to the UN adopting the Treaty on Principles Governing the Actions of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, better known as the Outer Space Treaty for short, or the OST for even shorter. The OST laid out the following rules for space.
1. The exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, and shall be the province of all mankind. 2. Outer space shall be free for exploration and use by all states. 3. Outer space is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. 4. States shall not place nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit, or on celestial bodies, or station them in outer space in any other manner. 5. The moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. 6. Astronauts shall be regarded as the envoys of mankind. 7. States shall be responsible for national space activities, whether carried out by governmental or non-governmental entities. 8. States shall be liable for damage caused by their space objects. And 9. States shall avoid harmful contamination of space and celestial bodies.
So keep these in mind because we're going to come back to them throughout the video, but probably the most radical part at the time that the treaty entered into effect was Article 3. The thing is that while all of this seemed very good and idealistic, that article in particular wound up backfiring on all these poorer countries demanding more equitable practices for the GEO. Since it once again been decided that space would be open territory, the richer countries were all like, sounds good, we're just gonna keep filling it on up with crap then, okay? This resulted in situations like in the early 70s when India and Indonesia were both trying to put satellites into the GEO, but couldn't because there were already satellites there that refused to move. Tensions continued to rise until a group of equatorial countries decided to do something. In '75, Colombia claimed the section of the GEO above their borders as their territory. The next year, Panama did the same, and then were joined by Brazil, the Congo, Zaire, now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ecuador, Indonesia, Kenya, and Uganda, who all signed the Bogota Declaration, in which they each claimed the section of the GEO above them as theirs, and started refusing to approve any new satellites in their supposed territory, while demanding that the ones currently there be removed. This, did not work. Every country with a space program flat out rejected the declaration, arguing that it would effectively put an end to any country being able to explore space, not to mention putting an end to most intercontinental telecommunications. The UK fought it in international court, pointing out that it was in strict violation of the OST, while Belgium called bullshit by arguing that none of the equatorial states that had signed the Bogota Declaration even had space programs, and so, setting the OST aside, they argued that since they couldn't make use of the GEO, they couldn't legally claim it. By the way, Belgium may seem like a random country to be getting involved here, but remember that Belgians never miss a chance to fuck up the Congo. In my personal opinion, while I am extremely sympathetic to all of these equatorial states and the intentions behind the Bogota Declaration, those other countries did make some good points. Like, something that it's important to keep in mind here is that as much as I'm criticizing how satellites get up there, it's a very good thing that we're able to make use of the GEO, and we want it to be fully utilized. And so, like, while I do absolutely think that access to the GEO should be more equitable, I feel like there has to be a better way of doing that than just throwing national borders up into outer space, a thing that would cause just so many extremely obvious problems. By the way, so far, I've been explaining the history of the GEO through a theoretical perspective called critical legal geography. Settle down. This isn't the thing where we teach white kindergarteners to hate themselves, although I do support that, although for completely unrelated reasons. Basically, a major school of thought in geography is based off of Michel Foucault's theory that spaces don't just exist as neutral things in the world, but instead are always created or given meaning in order to serve a certain purpose. You can then do all sorts of interesting analysis by asking how or why certain spaces were created. For instance, critical legal geographers take this and apply it to the legal system. For them, the function of the law can be understood as fundamentally being a way for the state to create spaces. By the way, the primary source for this whole section, and a really good way to learn more about this, is the fantastic paper, The Geostationary Orbit, A Critical Legal Geography of Space's Most Valuable Real Estate by Christy. But now, if you found my explanation of that theory kind of like abstract and confusing, then I am right there with you, brother. But for me personally, the Bogota Declaration was a really good example that kind of made it all click. Like, think about it. The thing that was at stake there wasn't just where countries get to put their satellites. This question about a fairly niche section of international law would actually have implications for the scientific question of where Earth ends and space begins in some pretty concrete ways. Anyways, while the Bogota Declaration obviously didn't succeed in any of its stated goals, it wasn't necessarily a failure either. Before 1975, the concerns of poorer countries weren't taken remotely seriously when it came to space exploration, or really anything else, we're being real here. But after Bogota, while things still weren't all fixed or anything, it became generally accepted that any plan for how the GEO should be run needed to at least include lip service for how to ensure equitable access for poorer countries. But shockingly, none of this lip service actually solved any of the issues with the ITU's first-come, first-served policy, which was allowing richer countries to snatch up all the good real estate and preventing poorer countries, many of whom were their former colonies, from building out satellite programs of their own. And so, in 1979, another, much more radical attempt was made to change things when the UN passed the agreement governing the activities of states on the moon and other celestial bodies, better known as the Moon Treaty. As the full name suggests, the treaty was meant to regulate what happens on the moon and other celestial objects enforced by an international regime. Most of the regulations are pretty straightforward things that you'd more or less expect, creating rules to prevent anyone from making huge changes to any celestial objects, and requiring the sharing of any scientific discoveries made in outer space, also no running with scissors on the moon, that sort of thing. Where this gets radical, though, is in Article 11, Clause 7D, which states that one of the main purposes of the international regime would be to ensure, quote,
an equitable sharing by all states parties in the benefits derived from those resources, whereby the interests and needs of the developing countries, as well as the efforts of those countries which have contributed either directly or indirectly to the exploration of the moon, shall be given special consideration.
What this means is that the Moon Treaty would require any economic value derived in outer space to be shared equitably between all countries, with most of it going to the poorer ones. Unsurprisingly, no spacefaring country has signed it. Instead, in 1988, a more reasonable compromise was finally made. Basically, all countries are guaranteed a number of spots in the GEO in a location that's as close as possible to the country of origin, plus all private satellites in the GEO are required to provide free service to any country that they're directly over top of. Honestly, surprisingly reasonable, right? Well, guess again, motherfuckers. This is We're in Hell, not we've reached a reasonable compromise. Shit's about to get fucked. One of the craziest issues with this arrangement involves Tonga, a tiny Polynesian island nation with a population of around 100,000. From 1965 to 2006, it was ruled by the hilariously corrupt King Tefua Tupou IV, who, when he wasn't aggressively persecuting pro-democracy activists and journalists, was losing massive chunks of the country's public funds to bad investments that were suggested to him by an American businessman named Jesse Bogdanoff, whose official title in the Tongan government was court jester. But Tupou IV had some pretty creative ways to bring money in, too. These included planning to make Tonga a nuclear waste disposal site, selling diplomatic passports, which explained why there was a sudden influx of Chinese citizens in the 80s, and selling the right to register under the Tonga flag to ships that were moving weapons for Al-Qaeda. And so, when an American businessman named Matt Nilsson approached the king with an offer to buy Tonga's GEO spots, Tafua Hau jumped at the opportunity and then had Nilsson make the checks out to the Tongan princess so that the government never saw a dime. And so, the Tongsat Corporation was born. This caused an international controversy when Intelsat freaked out, arguing that Tonga was setting a dangerous precedent of financial speculation on the GEO. Oh, sorry, for those of you who don't know Intelsat, you may have assumed that they're some government or UN committee. In reality, they are actually a private company that pays countries to let them put satellites in their unused GEO spots. You might now be thinking that that sounds an awful lot like what Tonga was doing, but no, it's completely different. You see, unlike the poor, struggling small business of Tongasat, Intelsat had a monopoly. Oh my god, it's so fucking cold. We're gloving up. It's like, oh, this will be such a good idea. I'll film outside on a roof. It'll look so cool. It'll be like a Pinely video. No, this sucks. This sucks so fucking hard. But there are lots of more mundane issues with the current satellite situation as well. First of all, when the new rules came in, everything that was already up there got grandfathered in, although satellites only have an average lifespan of 15 years, so this isn't that big of a deal. The bigger issue is that it's extremely common for new satellites to be put in spots that were reserved for someone else, because fuck you, who's gonna stop them? There are a few causes for this. One is that there's really no downside to claiming as many satellite spots as possible, and so countries and private companies will just grab a ton of them, sometimes with the intention of maybe using some of them, other times just because, why not? This has resulted in millions of what are called paper satellites, i.e. satellites that only exist on paper, that the ITU has no real way of distinguishing from real satellite plans. One proposed solution to this would be charging when spots aren't filled, but if they do that, then oops, now the only countries with access to space are the ones that are rich enough to pay those fees forever, and now we're just right back where we started. This is made worse because, like I said, we want the GEO to be used, and so the ITU will encourage people to just take spots. Plus, even if they didn't, it's a UN organization. They don't have enforcement power. Watch out, rich countries. If you step out of line, then an army of annoying Twitter leftists will share a map where only the US, Israel, and Ukraine are colored in. This is even worse when it comes to corporate satellites, where there's not really even the pretense of accountability. One notable example of this came in 2019 when a spacecraft called Beresheet crashed into the moon. What made Beresheet special was that it hadn't been launched by any government, but instead an Israeli company called Space IL, making it the first privately funded lunar mission, which was, appropriately, a massive shit show. And I'm not just talking about how the mission was underfunded, poorly designed, and lacked redundancy, all things that led to the crash. All that's bad enough, but more or less what you might expect from a company whose name is one letter off from Space L. The bigger issue was Beresheet's payload, which included a time capsule that was put together by an American nonprofit called Arc Mission Foundation. The plan was for the capsule to contain a full English copy of Wikipedia, 2 global language translation tools, memoirs of Holocaust survivors, the Torah and Israel's flag, national anthem, and Declaration of Independence. But at the very last minute, and without telling anyone, one of Arc Mission's founders decided to also add human DNA and a few thousand tardigrades, those little microscopic bears that are famous for being able to survive in any environment and have now been let loose on the moon. So, that's good. No, I mean, we definitely don't have to worry about tardigrades taking over the moon. There is a very small chance that they survive the crash, and even if they did, they would have immediately gone into a weird sort of hibernation where they can basically turn their cells into crystals. If that happens, it's definitely possible that they could be revived, but definitely not on the moon. The bigger issue, though, which I haven't seen many publications address very much, is the question of if the decision to put tardigrades or anything else on the moon should be left to one random person or even a single company. The problem is that Article 9 of the OST only says that states shall avoid harmful contamination of space and celestial bodies. It doesn't say anything about tech startups. I guess that there's always Article 7 that says that states are responsible for the actions of non-state government entities, but if there's anything that the last year has shown, it's that the UN isn't particularly good at holding Israel accountable for breaking international laws. And speaking of Israel, colonialism is a fundamental part of space exploration, going back to the very beginnings of astronomy in the West. The field originally developed out of star navigation for colonial expansion and plunder, and even today, there's very few parts of the discipline that aren't touched by this legacy in some way. Even going back to the beginning of our story, Namibia isn't only the home of the oldest cave paintings in Africa, but also the first genocide of the 20th century. There's a grim irony to the fact that as Earth's lower orbit is increasingly being filled up with satellites, astronomers are beginning to worry about them obscuring the views of their telescopes, many of which are themselves built on stolen indigenous land. If this continues, the colonization of space could wind up choking out the scientific discipline that gave birth to it. This only gets darker when we look into the more contemporary origins of space exploration, all of which is based off of the study of rocketry, one rocket in particular, the V2 missile. The V2, or in its original German, the Vergeltungswaffe, meaning vengeance weapon, was the invention of the Nazi scientist Werner von Braun and was assembled using the slave labor of concentration camp inmates. The V2 was the first man-made object to travel through space, as the Germans used it to bomb London, Antwerp, and Liège. After the war ended, the first priority of the Allies was to grab up as many V2 rockets as well as Nazi scientists as they could get their hands on. Braun himself was brought over to America as part of Operation Paperclip. The reason for this sudden scramble for rocket science was based out of the universal human desire to develop a way to drop nuclear bombs from low Earth orbit. Honestly, who among us hasn't looked up at the stars and asked deep questions like, where did we come from? Why are we here? And how can I melt the skin off of half the people in a major city? And so, with their collection of bombs and fascists in hand, the Allies got to work developing their rocketry programs. But another interesting aspect of this, though, was where they chose to do their testing. Each country selected an area that was relatively empty and uninhabited, but it's never really that simple. As I talked about in my video about Area 51, when an imperial power describes a place as a wasteland, there's a very good chance that the indigenous inhabitants of that place would strongly disagree. And sure enough, that's what happened, with France building their rocketry center in French Algeria, Britain setting up shop at the Woomera Range Complex in southern Australia, America repurposing the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, the site where they detonated the first ever atomic bomb, and the Soviets established Kapustin Yar at the border of Kazakhstan. The Australian writer Ivan Southall described Woomera as, quote,
"One of the greatest stretches of uninhabited wasteland on Earth, created by God specifically for rockets."
Later in the same book, he notes the massive archaeological significance of the area, saying,
"Lying on the ground here, there, and everywhere were tens of thousands of artifacts, discarded knives and spear points of flaked and chipped stone, dropped by unencumbered generations of black men, and one had to accept the artifacts at their face value. Where one found artifacts, one found water."
Likewise, the French scientists stationed in Algeria would spend their off time collecting flaked stone points that dated back to the Stone Age. Finally, one of the things I found most surprising while researching this was how the narrative of the space race between America and the Soviets being this sort of peaceful alternative to the Cold War was actually all bullshit. Like, sure, it being a morale boost and a sort of ideological victory was a thing, of course, but what it was really all about was that A country that can send a man into space was a country whose rocketry program had advanced to the point where they could also send a nuclear bomb to the other side of the world. All that rhetoric of discovery in the name of mankind was really just a smokescreen for better weapon development. Now, at this point, I feel like this might all be coming off as me, trying to cancel space exploration because of its problematic past. I want to take a quick minute to clarify that I don't subscribe to the idea that something is bad just because it has a messed up history. I think it's good and important to learn and reckon with the dark parts of our past, but I'm sorry, I always tend to roll my eyes a little whenever I see someone saying how X innocuous thing is bad actually because 300 years ago someone used it to be racist. It's funny too because no one ever really does the opposite and argues that some bad thing is good actually because of its unproblematic past, right? You never see people arguing that we shouldn't be so harsh on Agent Orange since it was originally designed to be a pesticide and was just repurposed for committing war crimes in Vietnam, or that gunpowder was invented to make pretty fireworks before being used to kill Batman's parents. But I'd argue that in the case of space exploration, all of this is a bit more relevant since it's still being used in fucked up ways to this very day and in ways that are very much tied to its past. One example of this is the weaponization of space. While the OST does ban the use of nuclear bombs or other weapons of mass destruction in space, in 2000 the UN decided to make extra sure by adopting a resolution on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. The resolution passed with a vote of 163 to 0 with 3 abstainers, America as well as Israel and the Federated States of Micronesia. If you're wondering about those last two, they make more sense when you realize that their militaries are provided mainly, if not entirely, by the US. See, while America had generally supported the weapons ban during the Cold War, by this point they were singing a very different tune. 2 months after the resolution was passed, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld made an announcement warning that America might put weapons in space anyways, but that it didn't violate the resolution since he argued that because America is so reliant on satellite technology, a space Pearl Harbor was, in his view, inevitable and therefore justified them arming their satellites for protection. Definitely no other reasons. It's totally fine, guys. To be fair here, Space Pearl Harbor does sound inevitable, but only as a Michael Bay movie sequel that's only slightly less historically accurate than the original. But the main way that countries get around these rules against weapons in space is through dual-use applications, i.e. using satellites whose applications could be peaceful and/or violent. It's very common for these operations to then also be classified as peacekeeping missions, which kind of works as a sort of no-homo, but for war crimes. The most common examples of these are satellite imaging and positioning systems. These involve using images from satellites to select and locate targets, as in the case of the peacekeeping mission that took place on April 23, 1999, when the US used satellite imaging to bomb a Serbian TV studio, or just by strapping a GPS to a bomb. These could either be smart bombs with built-in positioning equipment, or just attaching a JDAM kit to a dumb bomb, as has been done with the 2,000-pound bombs that Israel has been using to commit a genocide in Gaza. While in these cases satellite technology is being used for the purpose of warfare, this doesn't violate the OST, since rather than putting weapons in space, this just involves using satellites to enhance the capabilities of weapons down here on Earth. Now, a big part of how this is justified is by arguing that using these technologies to improve the accuracy of bombs and airstrikes allows militaries to reduce civilian deaths. The problem with that argument is that while satellite imaging is very effective for making sure that a target gets hit, it's not actually very good at identifying if said target is military or civilian. But also, this might be a feature, not a bug. In a paper titled Mobility and War, The Cosmic View of U.S. Air Power, Caren Kaplan argues that part of the reason for the mass reliance on satellite images in combat isn't their accuracy, but their usefulness in political rhetoric. On the one hand, showing satellite images of a conflict lends an air of legitimacy to a military operation, since they seem so scientific and objective. But At the same time, their imprecision hides and abstracts the actual degree of violence and bloodshed on the ground. At a certain distance from the action, even the most brutal war becomes a game of StarCraft. It's also worth noting that it really shouldn't come as any surprise that GPS is being used by the military, since that's very much where it came from long before it was ever used by civilians. What would become GPS was originally developed to track Sputnik, and then later used by the US to keep tabs on the exact locations of nuclear submarines, the same way you might put an AirTag on your keychain or in your backpack. Except, in this case, rather than trying to not lose your water bottle and some library books, the thing that the US government was worried about misplacing were Polaris ballistic nuclear missiles. I'm always forgetting those things at the bar. In fact, when Reagan first made GPS available for civilians in 1983, they intentionally nerfed it by adding interference to the signal, reducing its accuracy to 100 meters of its target. It wasn't until 2000 that Clinton lifted the restriction and allowed civilians to get 10 to 20 meters of accuracy, which he did because other countries had by then developed their own satellite positioning systems, while the US had gotten real good at GPS blockers. Finally, this isn't just a matter of the past of space exploration, but also its future. As Fraser MacDonald points out in the paper Anti-Astropolitik, Outer Space in the Orbit of Geography, the colonization of space uses the same justifications as colonialism on Earth, the same rhetoric, and it's being done by the same people. You get the clearest idea of this by looking into who's advocating for the colonization of space today. Now, as far as academic and policy fields go, practical political theory on the colonization of space is pretty niche, but one person with a relatively huge impact here is Everett Dolman, an ex-CIA analyst and current academic. Dolman's work has won him a lot of fans in neocon think tanks in Washington, particularly for his book Astropolitik, Classical Geopolitics in the Space Age. In this book, Dolman makes a militaristic and free market case for space colonization based on the geopolitical theory of geopolitik, which the title is a reference to. For anyone who doesn't know, heads up, I'm about to use a bunch of words that sound the same and only have slightly differing meanings. So, Realpolitik is a geopolitical theory that focuses on nations acting out of self-interest without considering morals or ideology, and tends to advocate for diplomacy and maintaining of a balance of power to keep order. Geopolitik is a German version of that, but focuses its analysis more on geographical details and also places a lot of emphasis on social Darwinism and the belief that nations should achieve self-sufficiency through expansion, as opposed to trade. It was most famously used by the Nazis for the planning of World War II. Basically, geopolitik is a way for fascists to intellectually justify what they already wanted to do while claiming that they're just being logical. Totally different from realpolitik, which has historically been a way for neoliberals and neocons to justify doing what they already want to do while claiming that they're just being logical. Dolman is extremely upfront about this and regularly brings up the connection to the Nazis, claiming that this is a cautionary warning about how dangerous his ideas are.
The term astropolitik is chosen as a constant reminder to those who would read this book and carefully weigh many of its claims of the horrible depths to which other geopolitical-based realpolitik strategies of dominance ultimately degenerated. The German school of geopolitik, despite the equivocal intentions of its founders, became a racist and utterly unscientific invective about the superiority of the Aryan race and its inevitable domination of the world. Geopolitik, too, was a grand strategy, an action plan for conquest. The good intentions of the author of the current work aside, the potential for misuse and abuse of astropolitik is plain.
So to me, this kind of just reads the same way as when the CEO of an AI startup claims that their technology is just so powerful that it could end humanity as a very transparent way to build hype. Oh, be careful, the things I'm going to say in this book are so powerful that whoever reads it will definitely be able to dominate space and create an interplanetary fascist dictatorship. I sure hope my forbidden wisdom doesn't wind up in the wrong hands. But this all becomes a lot less believable as you read more of the book, and it becomes very clear that the thing Dolman wants is an interplanetary fascist dictatorship. For example, he's against the OST because he believes that preventing countries from claiming territory in space is stifling innovation, adding that,
while it is morally desirable to explore space in common with all peoples, even the thought of doing so makes weary those who have the means.
Or regarding the Moon Treaty, he writes the
harsh reality is that following a hypothetical scramble for the moon or any other land grab scenario, Bangladesh, Burkina Faso, and Uruguay would own no less of the moon than they do now.
Cool, very cool. So who does he think should be in charge in outer space then? Well, obviously America. This is mostly because of their military supremacy, but also their values.
The U.S. form of liberal democracy is conducted within the rule of law. It is admirable and socially encompassing. If any one state should dominate space, it ought to be one with a constitutive political principle that government should be responsible and responsive to its people, tolerant and accepting of their views, and willing to extend legal and political equality to all.
But that respect for democratic values is, again, a bit hard to take seriously when literally 2 paragraphs earlier he wrote that,
such is the case today that in space, at the very least, the United States can adopt any policy it wishes, and the attitudes and reactions of the domestic public and other states can do little to challenge it.
What I like about America is that they have such a beautiful democracy with acceptance and equality for all. But what I love about America is that its military is powerful enough that they can ignore that democracy whenever they want to. There's also a chapter where he talks in great detail about how genetically superior he imagines the first colonists will be, but I'll spare you those quotes. Again, while space travel having roots in colonialism isn't, in my opinion, enough to write the whole endeavor off as problematic, it should be very concerning that the people who might have the best chance of making this a reality are reading this guy and fantasizing about bringing the field back to the good old days. But for now, though, these are mostly just fascistic fantasies, and honestly, I don't really believe that there's much reason to think that humans terraforming other planets will be more than that in any reasonable amount of time, if ever at all. And so, let's move now to discussing what mankind's legacy will probably look like. The roof got too cold, so we're in my backyard now. So one of the most interesting things I learned about for this video is the surprisingly deep field of space archaeology. So as space junk becomes more and more of a problem, we're working on potential solutions like building cleanup satellites that just shovel up all the trash, or just blasting it out of the sky with high-powered lasers. Both real things that supposedly very smart people are seriously considering. But one of the questions that arises from this is whether or not there are some things that should be left up there because of their historical value. There are, after all, a lot of pretty cool things up in space. The archaeology of space junk also poses an interesting question, though, about what actually constitutes trash. As the foremost and probably only space archaeologist Alice Gorman points out in her book, Dr. Space Junk vs. the Universe, part of what makes something trash generally isn't just that it's abandoned or without value, but also that it's not part of nature. This is part of why litter is seen as bad and becomes worse the more remote it is. Last year, they found a plastic bag at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. This strikes such a chord because of how remote and seemingly untouchable the deepest part of the ocean is. Does space junk fit this, though? On the one hand, it kinda does, since space junk is so far out. And so from that point of view, space junk should be viscerally upsetting. But on the other hand, where else could be a more appropriate location for decommissioned satellites than in space? But if these decommissioned satellites are going to be the last traces of humanity, let's talk about time capsules, and first of all, what they even really are. In an essay titled Cultural Heritage as a Futuristic Field, Cornelius, Holtorf, and Anders Högberg argue that one of the biggest things that we tend to get nostalgic for is past visions of the future. These tend to be so appealing to look back on since they show us such a sharp contrast between the hopeful fantasies of the past compared to the boring mundanity of reality. A great example of this is actually satellites. As Alice Gorman points out in her book, the very earliest satellites were gorgeous. I mean, just look at this. A big part of the reason for this was because these were built at a time when space exploration was still a utopian fantasy that was just beginning to be realized, and that hopefulness is clearly presented in the aesthetic of the design. Compare that to modern satellites, which are generally just various cubes with solar panels. This is actually an extension of the latest developments in satellites, picosats or CubeSats, small cubes that are extremely cheap to make and use. This has genuinely been a massive boon to scientists who now face way less of a cost barrier to study space as the process for making satellites has become much cheaper and practical. But that's the thing, right? Satellites aren't some exciting new possibility anymore. They're ordinary, practical, affordable, everyday things that we interact with on a regular basis. And so they look like it too. But the thing about time capsules is that these past visions of the future are exactly what they're best at capturing. This is an inherent aspect of any time capsule that comes through not just in what the people making it decide to preserve, but also in the preservation method itself. Holtorf and Högberg demonstrate this in another paper called Perceptions of the Future in Preservation Strategies, or Why Eyssl von Eysselsberg's Body is No Longer Taken Across the Lake, where they look at different preservation methods all done in the Austrian village of Hallstatt, and what each one says about the kind of future being imagined by the people making them. The first example is Hallstatt's Chapel of St. Michael's, which dates back to the 12th century. Underneath it is an ossuary containing 1,200 skulls, around half of which have names and dates of death written on them. This was done as part of a religious tradition that began 300 years ago. The skulls are taken care of by the church and local community, and so the article argues that this time capsule represents a faith that the chapel and the village will continue to preserve this practice indefinitely. For them, this is a form of preservation that assumes a future that has continuity with the present. But we can also see a different kind of preservation being done in the same church in the case of the coffin of Christoph Eyssl von Eysselsberg, a wealthy administrator at the local salt mine who died in 1668. Eysselsberg's will calls for his coffin to be removed from the crypt and taken across the nearby lake as a religious ritual every 50 years on the anniversary of his death. Imagine having so much money that you could just buy yourself a religious ritual. I know I'll be dead, but if I know these bones, every 50 years they'll want a little vacation. While this seems fairly similar to the preservation of the skulls, the big difference here is that Eysselsberg seemed to have anticipated that the culture of the town would change, and so took measures to preserve his legacy despite that. By doing this ritual every 50 years, he basically ensured that every generation would have a connection to his memory. Unlike the previous method, this assumes that some small or manageable changes will happen and then takes measures to maintain continuity despite them. Finally, there are preservation methods that assume a full-on break in continuity. An absolutely wild example of this is happening right now in the Hallstatt salt mines, where a ceramicist named Martin Kunz is building the Memory of Mankind, meant to be a full recording of humanity inscribed in a series of ceramic tablets, which will eventually be sealed off. The archive's location will then be disseminated using these 6.5 centimeter ceramic discs, which Kunz plans to scatter all over the world. He seems weird. And so while all three of these examples are effectively trying to do the same thing, preserve the past, the radically different expectations that they have for the future inform every aspect of not just what is preserved, but how it's being done. Now, regardless of how deranged Kunz's plan is, his form of preservation is the closest to the kind that we're interested in. So now, let's turn our attention to the most famous time capsules in space. In 1972 and 73, NASA launched Pioneers 10 and 11, the first man-made objects to leave the solar system. In 77, they were joined by Voyagers 1 and 2. All 4 space probes included golden plaques designed by a team led by Carl Sagan, meant to serve as potential postcards for aliens. The Pioneer plaques show a naked man and woman drawn by Carl Sagan's wife Linda and an intergalactic map to Earth developed by the astrophysicist Frank Drake, which is apparently now like the #1 basic tattoo for astronomers. Sagan and his team went even further with the Voyager probes, creating golden records. One side of the records play Greetings from Earth and the UN in 55 languages, a collection of sounds from Earth, which you're listening to right now, and 26 pieces of music from different countries selected to give as broad a range of musical styles as possible, while the other side has a collection of photographs encoded as a video. The images show snapshots of Earth, with everything from scientific diagrams of DNA and the structure of the Earth, to human anatomy, to world monuments, to this incredibly cursed photo titled Demonstration of Licking, Eating, and Drinking, which, I suppose it is that. I love this one so much since, it's not all clear to me if the title is meant to describe what's shown here or what the 3 people in this picture desperately need to receive. But while the stated purpose of these is to provide interstellar aliens with some kind of record of humanity, Alice Gorman argues that in reality, the main beneficiaries of these are back here on Earth. She points out how these records and plaques are the perfect time capsules, precisely because we will never open them. Instead, as they drift further and further away, they serve as a vessel for all of our utopian dreams of space, while ignoring the much more mundane and sinister realities of space exploration floating in Earth's orbit. It's kind of perfect, then, that in 1981, 9 years after the launch of Voyager 10, members of the team that developed the plaques and records were brought onto a much darker project. As nuclear research had developed since the end of World War II, a growing problem needed addressing. What do you do with nuclear waste that will remain radioactive for the next 10,000 years? What kind of warning signs would keep people away at a time so far into the future that there's no guarantee that current symbols or even languages will still be around? And so, the US Department of Energy, in partnership with the Bechdel Corporation, gathered a team of experts in nuclear physics, linguistics, and semiotics, including Frank Drake as well as John Lomberg, one of the people who worked on the pictures of the Voyager records. Carl Sagan was asked but refused on moral grounds. Sagan's just like, dump that shit straight in the ocean, baby. Fuck the whales. But no, it makes so much sense though, right? Who else could you possibly ask for help with something like that? One of the most famous solutions they came up with was a message, which was meant to be translated into every major language and then carved into stone tablets. The message reads,
"This place is a message, and part of a system of messages. Pay attention to it. Sending this message was important to us. We considered ourselves to be a powerful culture. This place is not a place of honor. No highly esteemed deed is commemorated here. Nothing valued is here. What is here was dangerous and repulsive to us. This message is a warning about danger. The danger is in a particular location. It increases towards the center. The center of danger is here, of a particular size and shape and below us. The danger is still present, in your time as it was in ours. The danger is to the body and it can kill. The form of the danger is an emanation of energy. The danger is unleashed only if you substantially disturb this place physically. This place is best shunned and left uninhabited."
From there, things get significantly stranger. The most iconic suggestion was to build a field of concrete spikes. There were also proposals for new symbols for buried radioactive waste. This one's my favorite since I don't think that I could come up with a less intuitive way of communicating that information if I tried. And those were just the reasonable ideas. One person suggested that since we had no guarantee written language would still exist 10,000 years from now, we should instead create what he called a nuclear priesthood. Essentially, the idea was for the government to create a cult based around the idea of never digging up what was buried and entrusting them to carry that message on into the future through religion and myths. Another idea was instead to breed a new race of cats that change color when exposed to nuclear radiation, and then spreading a nursery rhyme that warns people to beware when the cats change colors. And I feel like that had to have been the point when someone should have stepped in and just been like, okay guys, I know I said that there's no bad ideas in brainstorming, but what are we even doing here? No, but seriously, I love everything about this. Come on, this is so fucking cool. It's like they set out specifically to create the subject of a Jacob Geller video. Now, I hate to burst everyone's bubble here, but none of this stuff is actually happening. Obviously. Did you actually think that the government was going to spend billions of dollars breeding radiation cats or building what is essentially a piece of installation art to protect the health of people 10,000 years into the future? They don't spend that kind of money to help people who are alive today. With that said, I think that these ideas for long-term nuclear waste warnings can best be understood as another kind of time capsule. This one born out of the terror of the Cold War and serving as an apology to the future. Despite how grim that seems, I actually think that, like the Voyager records, the motivation behind this was ultimately optimism. Optimism for a future that still had humans in it. Humans who will be enlightened enough to see the creation of nuclear bombs as an unforgivable sin that our society has committed. On that cheery note, let's finish this video off with something much lighter.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. Others will follow and surely find their way home. Man's search will not be denied. But these men were the first, and they will remain the foremost in our hearts. For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind.
So what you just heard was a speech Richard Nixon had prepared in case the Apollo astronauts died during their mission. For all this talk about graveyards and legacies, it's interesting that there's almost no human remains in outer space. At time of recording. You may have heard of those companies that people can pay to shoot their remains into space, but all those actually do is just shoot ashes into the atmosphere to burn up there. Fucking ripoff, am I right, people? This video is a call-out. There are actually just a couple of exceptions. One is the man who discovered Pluto, Clyde Tombaugh, who died in 1997 at the age of 90. In 2006, some of his ashes were put into the New Horizons space probe. In 2015, New Horizons flew by the dwarf planet Tombaugh discovered before moving on to become the fifth and currently final spacecraft to leave our solar system. The vial containing his ashes is inscribed with the following message. Interned herein are remains of American Clyde W. Tombaugh, discoverer of Pluto and the solar system's third zone. Adele and Murren's boy, Patricia's husband, Annette and Alden's father, astronomer, teacher, punster, and friend. Clyde W. Tombaugh, 1906 to 1997. The other exception is Eugene Shoemaker, who was an extremely accomplished scientist. He worked on the Apollo missions, helped discover the Shoemaker-Levy comet, but was most famous for his work in geology studying impact craters. In 1997, he died when he and his wife Carolyn, herself an extremely accomplished astronomer, were in a head-on collision while researching craters in the Northern Territory of Australia. In 1998, to honor him, a portion of his ashes were placed on the Lunar Prospector space probe. The probe successfully studied the properties of the lunar pole, and then, once the mission had ended, it was intentionally crashed into a crater, making Eugene Shoemaker the only person to ever be buried outside of Earth. Inscribed around the vial containing his ashes was a quote from Romeo and Juliet. "And when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun." As we continue to explore the stars, it's inevitable that there will be human remains outside of Earth. Life in space necessarily means death in space. And I wonder, how will our view of space change once there are dead bodies out there? Will we see it as a more frightening thing when there's actual skeletons floating through the void? Or could it maybe lead to a more human view of things? If not for us, then maybe some alien archaeologists billions of years from now. It's a little bit idealistic, but still, I'd much rather humanity's gravestone look more like Tombaugh's or Shoemaker's than the graveyard orbit. Thanks for watching.